Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today, we're going to be talking about the most overrated pieces of gear in the studio. These are the things that we like to obsess over that don't make that much of a difference, or at least not as much of a difference as we like to think or pretend that they do. These are things that people waste way too much money and way too much time obsessing over when there's much lower hanging fruit that are going to get you much better results in the studio. So we'll talk about some of the most overrated pieces of gear, but also some of the most underrated pieces of gear in the studio. Do you have any guesses as to what mine are going to be? I want to hear about yours. Let me know in the comments down below. If you're here on the YouTube or Facebook video versions of this, stick your nominations for the most overrated and underrated pieces of gear in the studio in the comments down below. Or if you're listening to an audio-only version or you prefer to email me, just shoot me an email at podcast@sonicscoop.com. I want to hear your picks. Before we get into my top picks for both of these categories, quick shout out to our sponsors, Soundtoys, making some of the best plugins in the universe. Not one of them overrated. Is it possible that underrated? I don't know. I think that they get appropriate amounts of acclaim. Everybody loves them because they're great. If you don't love them yet, it's probably because you haven't tried them. Go try out anything they make for free for a full 30 days. One of the most generous demo periods in the music business. Check them out, soundtoys.com. You got to check them out. Tons of great creative mixing effects there. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite, making some of the best bang for the buck interfaces out there. Check out their whole line from the entry-level Scarlett series all the way up to the high-end RedNet series over at Focusrite.com. All right, let's get into the meat of this episode. What are some of the most overrated pieces of gear in the studio? What are some of the most underrated pieces of gear? All right, overrated piece of gear, number one. I'm going to get flack for this in the comments down below. I'm going to get flack for every one of these overrated pieces of gear, but I think those of you who are truly wise and skilled in the ways of audio production will see where I'm going with this, and it is mic preamps. Number one most overrated piece of gear in the studio, in my humble opinion. And this is coming from a guy who loves mic preamps and can nerd out about mic preamps. In fact, I did a video with Universal Audio not too long ago where I went through their mic preamp models and I fell back in love with mic preamps. And there are some mic preamps that will sound different from one another. Like you go through a Telefunken V76 mic preamp and it does kind of warm things up and fatten things up and round them out and give them this extra girth. You put a vocal through a Neve 1073 preamp, and it does have this kind of silky little push about it. Like there's cool things going on with some mic preamps. And some of them will have differences that are discernible when you're listening blind. But let's face it, compared to so many of the other pieces of gear and changes that we can make in the studio, the contribution of mic preamps is pretty darn small. And to a degree, a lot of the differences we hear and feel are pretty subtle. If you actually really start to evaluate this stuff, especially in blind listening tests, a lot of preamps will sound more or less indistinguishable from each other. Some preamps will have a particular character, but is it going to make or break your record? No. Could changing just about anything else make more of an impact? Probably yes, right? Changing the instrument, changing the player, changing the microphone that's plugged into that mic preamp. All of these things have a dramatically bigger effect on your sound than the mic preamp itself. This is not to say that, again, that mic preamps don't matter. It's just that the degree to which we kind of venerate mic preamps is not commensurate with how much impact they have on your sound. And people will often be surprised at how subtle some of these differences are when they actually do blind listening tests for the first time. And they'll find that a lot of different preamps, not that many distinguishable differences. A few preamps might jump out as really doing something, but are they doing as much as swapping your mic? Are they doing as much as the EQ that you're going to apply later on, the compression you're going to apply later on, the effects? No. The difference that they make is small and subtle. So compared to the amount of esteem that we give them, I'm going to say that they're a little overrated. I remember I used to travel with a rig of audio gear that I would bring on recording sessions with me when I was more in my recording days and doing a lot of recording in other studios and a lot of live recordings. I had my rig, which included a bunch of different mic preamps, so I could pick different mic preamps for different instruments. And you like the Neve and Neve style preamps, more on these elements, and the API and API style preamps, more on these other elements. And do API and Neve preamps sound different? Yeah, there are some differences there. There's no doubt about it. But I also remember renting some of my portable gear rig to a friend and client who was doing some own sessions in a remote location, lent him some microphones to use, lent him some interfaces, and he brought the stuff back, and he had a lot of fun with a lot of it. He had a lot of fun with a lot of different mics that he found he got significantly different results with. And some of the snare drums that were kind of in my travel kit, man, those really dramatically change the sound of things. But he gave me back the preamps. He's like, I expected these preamps to do more. Like, he expected them to be this magic totem that was going to dramatically improve the sound of everything he put through them. And ultimately, that's not how preamps work. There are subtle differences between them. They're not going to magically fix any sound. They're not going to magically morph or reshape or dramatically transform a sound. They can make things sound subtly different. Subtly more saturated, subtly darker, subtly faster and brighter and clear. But we're talking about subtle here. Things that can be discerned in blind listening tests by experienced users. Yes, some of them, some of the time, but some of them no. And I remember there being this blind listening test on a forum ages ago where someone had created these CDs comparing all these high-end preamps to each other on a variety of sources. And most of them sounded almost identical to each other with a couple of exceptions that really kind of stood out a little bit. And that's really how preamps kind of work overall. The difference is not huge. It's there. It's somewhat subtle, somewhat discernible, and to nerds like me, like, it makes a difference, but they just don't make as much of a difference as they are sold to make. So that's why they have to be overrated piece of gear number one. It's not that they're a useless piece of gear. It's not that something not to spend money at all on, but it's something to not prioritize as much as sexy marketing would have you believe. And that was not just my experience, but the experience of countless recording engineers, audiophiles, music producers who had the same feedback on this forum. Like, a lot of them sounded really similar, and a couple of them kind of stood out, but the differences were somewhat subtle compared to the differences that people were being sold on. And this is, again, coming from someone who does a lot of blind listening tests, can discern very small differences, because when I say stuff like this, the comments are going to be filled with people who are saying, maybe you can't hear the difference, but people like me. It's like, no, I'm one of those people. I'm one of the nerds who can hear these differences. I don't make a big deal of that because I don't like to brag about or bring up that I like to do blind listening tests. But inevitably, people in the comments will say, maybe you can't hear the difference. And then almost inevitably, those same people are people who don't actually do blind listening tests. Because people who actually do blind listening tests come to conclusions like, yeah, I can tell the difference between 128 kilobits per second MP3 and higher resolutions, but the differences are actually relatively subtle compared to what they were in the past, and I can understand why the majority of people can't do that, who haven't trained themselves to do that. And those are the kinds of things you're going to hear people say who actually do blind listening tests. They don't say things like, maybe you can't hear us, but us brilliant. They don't say that because they've done blind listening tests and they know how double blind listening and the placebo effect and all that stuff works. So just that disclaimer out of the way, which will get us now into area number 2 of things that are overrated. And I'm sure I'll get a few people down in the comments below who are going to say, maybe you can't hear the difference, but we golden-eared people can, and that is converters. Overrated piece of gear number 2, converters. And this is not to say that converters don't matter. And this is not to say that converters can't make a difference in your sound. They can and do sound different. But interestingly, with most analog to digital converters, it's not the actual conversion that's any different between the converters. Many brands of converters actually get all of their converter chips from like literally the same factory. And you have like a high-end converter and like a mid-range converter and maybe a relatively low-end converter that literally have the same converter chips in them. Like, it's the same converter. What makes them sound different from one another in a lot of cases is the analog front end before you actually hit the converters. And that is where there's a difference in sound in most analog to digital converters. And that difference can be very subtle. One of the most significant ones out there, converters that I love, are the Burl converters. They sound wonderful. They definitely have a tone. They definitely kind of thicken things up a little bit, make things sound a little bit more like vintage or retro, like in a good kind of high quality way. And they definitely can be discerned to sound different in double-blind listening tests from other converters, and I can pick them out against most other converters. But very little of that has to do with the actual conversion chips, and has to do, again, with the analog front end in the device. So can there be subtle differences in the analog front end to converters to make them sound subtly different? Yes. Is it as significant and as big of a deal as it's made out to be? No. And that's what makes them, again, one of the most overrated pieces of gear in the studio. This works not only on the analog to digital end, but I'd argue it actually works even more on the digital to analog end, where you probably don't want your converter coloring things, so the goal is even more to have things be neutral and transparent. And you'd be amazed if you were to do a double-blind listening test with like the output of a good MacBook Pro laptop versus some standalone converter that costs much, much more. This is not to say that there, in all cases, will be no difference. There may be some differences in some cases, but if you actually do the double-blind listening tests, you may be amazed to discover for yourself either how small those differences are in some cases or how basically indiscernible they are in some cases. And again, not to say that there's no difference ever, but those differences, relatively subtle, even in sighted listening tests much of the time, and even more subtle in proper double-blind listening tests. And this is, again, coming from a guy who nerds out about this stuff and likes to try out different converters. And I helped a studio select, when we first heard the Burl converters, the studio I was working at that point wanted to select the best converters and spend a bunch of money on getting the best stuff they could. And we compared Burl to a few other high-end options. And we were all super annoyed to find out that we liked the Burl stuff the best double-blind for that particular application and that particular time period, because they were the most expensive option that we were looking at. So we wanted that not to be the answer. And this is not supposed to be an endorsement of Burl specifically. There's other great preamps, some of which you'd value because they can be discerned from others and sound different because they're messing up the sound in ways that are pleasing. And that's something you're going to find about very discernible converters are messing up the sound, technically speaking, in ways that you just think you like and sounds good. And there's going to be other converters that are maybe more transparent, very much close to the source that you're feeding into them. And you may like those more or less depending on your needs. But the big thing here is I don't want you to obsess about whether you're going to select the right converters, whether you're going to select the right preamps. Do it because it's fun and it's interesting and you have the extra resources. But if you don't have the extra resources, don't worry about it. You know for a fact that better records than the ones you're making right now have been made with worse gear than you currently have. You know that to be true in your heart of hearts. And you're hoping that you can like buy a fix to all of your problems. But you're not going to buy a fix to all of your problems by spending a lot of money on preamps or converters. It's not to say that you shouldn't value preamps and converters at all. You probably should. But let's also focus on the things that are under-recognized, undervalued, underrated. They are something that you start looking at when everything else in your studio is sorted out. You're in great shape on so many other fronts, and you have extra disposable income that you want to do something with in the studio. Start looking at mic preamps. Start looking at converters. But should you be looking down at yourself or your productions or what you're doing in the studio because you don't have the fanciest preamps or converters? No, absolutely not. These are things that are going to improve what you're doing a few percent around the edges once you have the other more important underrated things taken care of. Man, I could probably give you some more examples of overrated pieces of gear, but I don't want to spend too much longer on that. I want to talk about the underrated pieces. And the big number one underrated piece you can see behind me right now is those speakers. They're pretty high on the list, but I don't think speakers are underrated in the studio. is the instruments. I could say instruments are, an underrated piece of gear, but I don't think they're underrated. For actual musicians who play, they're not underrated at all. Microphones, I don't think microphones get underrated in the studio. What is it? It's these acoustic panels behind me. Easily one of the most underrated pieces of gear in the studio, the acoustic treatment that goes into your room. And it amazes me when I hear people giving the advice of get a nicer preamp or get a nicer converter when the person in question hasn't treated the room yet. It amazes me when I see people debating about which preamp or, God forbid, which type of cable is the best one for them to be using when they haven't treated the room yet. The room environment that you're in is one of the most important things, period. I mean, just having a space that's climate controlled, relatively, hopefully well acoustically isolated from the environment around you, those are super nice things to have. But at the very least, you can maybe have workarounds for your air conditioner being broken. You can maybe have workarounds for not being totally acoustically isolated. But it's pretty hard to have workarounds for being a room that sounds bad and colors everything that you record in it in an annoying sounding way and makes it so you can't make good mixing decisions when you're putting the finishing touches on things. So, acoustic treatment, one of the most underrated pieces of gear in the studio. Super important. And there are other things about a space in general that are super important that people don't think about. If you're trying to attract clients to your studio, having like a good couch, like a good looking couch, as opposed to like a totally demolished dog chewed couch, like that's actually a big deal. Having good climate control with quiet air conditioning, man, this is something that I've realized because my air conditioning has been on the fritz lately. I can't run it during the recording of the Sonic Scoop podcast episodes because it's too loud until it gets fixed. And I find myself having to wipe my face so I don't have like a sweat mustache in every episode of the podcast. Man, those things are huge. Like having just a good climate control in your room. So everything about your room, the space you're in, matters so much more than preamps or converters ever will. Again, I can't say that speakers or microphones are underrated or overrated in the studio. I think that they're important. The contributions they make are bigger than that of A to D converters or D to A converters or mic preamps. So they're not totally overrated either, but I don't think they're underrated. But something that is a little bit more underrated, I think, are some of the special tools that can really allow you to do your job or not. Things like denoisers that remove crackles, clicks, pops, background noise, crickets, which I can actually hear lightly through my double pane windows right now, even in this studio. So those kinds of things I think can be super essential and a little bit underrated. Like they're not as sexy as some of those big ticket items we were discussing earlier, but they can either help you get the job done or not. Things like tuning and pitch correction, things like de-essers. I think those are items that are going to save your butt in the studio much more than some of the other things. So if you have not gotten your studio in order as far as the physical space, the acoustic treatment, maybe things like microphones and speakers, and maybe slightly more underrated headphones as a great secondary reference, and headphones that you want to be of good quality for recording that are comfortable so that you can hear like these things. Once you get microphones, speakers, the space, the actual song arrangement, all of that stuff, all of this other stuff, lower hanging fruit sorted out, that's when you worry about the overrated gear. But way too many people find the marketing too effective on some of the overrated gear, and they worry about the overrated gear first, or second guess themselves and second guess their work and don't end up being as confident in the studio as they could be because they think those things matter much more than they do. I could go on and on about underrated and overrated pieces of gear. More underrated pieces of gear could include your DAW. It does so much by itself before you even buy any additional plugins, as much as I love having additional plugins. The lighting in your studio and how that can set mood. You don't have any even dimmers in your studio yet? I would say get some like good dimmers that don't hum before you go spend 10x more on converters, or some of the Philips Hue bulbs, something like that, for setting mood in the studio before you worry about spending thousands more on the next preamp. Like, have you sorted out the lowest hanging fruit yet? Because there's so many improvements that cost so much less than getting the highest level in the sexiest pieces in the overrated gear. Work on the underrated stuff first. The things that aren't the big ticket sexy items, but that are going to get you better results and also improve the actual quality of your working life in the studio significantly more than the overrated pieces of gear. That's enough yakking out of me. I want to hear your picks for the most overrated and underrated pieces of gear in the studio. Let me know in the comments down below or shoot me an email at podcast@sonicscoop.com. Is there anything you missed, anything you want to quibble with? Tell us about it, please, please, please. If you want more free stuff from me, and this has been useful, you can check out one of the free workshops I recently put out called the 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer. You can get that at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits, where you can learn about the 5 things that all the very best mixers working do in every single one of their mixes. Every single one of the great mixers I've studied do at least 4 of these things, and most of them do all 5. I want you to be one of them too. Go to sonicscoop.com/mixhabits to get that workshop for free. Or if you want an intro and primer to mastering, you can get that at sonicscoop.com/mastering101. That's sonicscoop.com/mastering101. Last but not least, I got the full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs that will change your life and your mixing for the better forever, making you mix more confidently, faster, and with better results than ever before. This is about the lowest hanging fruits in mixing and coming up with a roadmap and a plan of attack to take you through every single mix. Or if you want to know everything I know about mastering, literally everything I know about mastering, you can check out the Mastering Demystified course over at masteringdemystified.com. Full money-back guarantee on all of these. I know you're going to love them. Shout out and thanks to our sponsor, Sound Toys, for making not overrated and also not underrated, but amazing plugins that are loved by everyone who's tried them world over. You got to be one of those people too. If you don't love them yet, it's probably because you haven't tried them. So go and try them for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite, making some of the best bang for the buck interfaces out there, from the entry-level Scarlett line, which is one of the most popular selling interface lines in history and for good reason, all the way up to their high-end RedNet series. Tremendous value with tremendous quality. All right, big thanks to those guys. Big thanks to you for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.